Good morning. We are up to chapter 5 for the semester, Sport and Mythology. Sport and Mythology. Um, I think it's a long chapter, but I don't think there's a tremendous amount for us to kind of discuss, mostly because I think the context of this chapter really should be kind of lived and experienced, or in your case, remembered. All right, so I kind of want to start really just talking about one of my favorite times of being a fan, right? Now, for you guys, the winter of 2012, I mean, how old were you guys? I mean, you guys might have been somewhere between 8 and 12, 8 and 13 years old, depending on how old you were. Remember, in terms of my allegiances, I'm probably a Knicks fan first and foremost. And it was the winter 2012, and at the time, if you guys remember, or if any of you are New York Knicks fans, the Knicks had a pretty good team, right? And they hadn't had a great team since the mid 90s, right? When the Knicks made it to the NBA Finals in 1994, they hadn't had a great team. But all of a sudden, the year or 2 years prior, the New York Knicks traded like literally half their team to get Carmelo Anthony. They signed Amari Stoudemire, and at the time, Carmelo Anthony was probably a top 5 player in the NBA. Amari Stoudemire was a phenomenal player. They had Amari Stoudemire before they got Carmelo Anthony, and for a point in time, he was playing like an MVP. So they had these two stud players, right? We're really looking to make a deep run in the playoffs. And then, sure enough, Carmelo Anthony was injured at the midpoint of the season. And beyond that, the New York Knicks record really wasn't anything crazy. They're playing probably just around 500 basketball, maybe just below, and things were not looking good. I just distinctly remember being a Knicks fan and just being like, here we go. Carmelo was injured. We're below 500. Yeah, we've got no shot. And then it starts, and I cannot do this story justice. If any of you remember, it started off with just like, I don't know, there was a game and this guy, this 170-pound, 6'3" guard, drops like 25 points, assists, and the Knicks end up winning. And really, no one had heard of this guy, Jeremy Lin. Like, who is this guy? And what happened for the next few weeks was one of the most captivating times to be a Knicks fan, an NBA fan, and really just a person in the country, because it was headlines across the world, right? This 170-pound guy ended up like having, first of all, it's the New York Knicks, one of the biggest markets in the world. He had multiple games over 25 points in the NBA. This included game-winning buzzer beaters. One of my favorite parts of the story is because Kobe Bryant's my favorite player. There was an interview with Kobe Bryant, and it was like in the middle of Linsanity, and they said, "What do you think about Jeremy Lin?" And Kobe Bryant said, "But Jeremy who? Like, who are you talking about?" And then, sure enough, in that very night, Jeremy Lin outscored Kobe Bryant. He scored around 35, 38 points, and the Knicks ended up beating the Lakers. And again, it was a crazy time to be a Knicks fan. It was absolutely unbelievable, and there's so much more context to this story. I mean, everyone was saying how a few weeks prior, or even during the run, I believe it was, he was sleeping on a teammate's couch because he didn't have a place to live. He was undrafted, right? Everything about this story, it was absolutely improbable, impossible, yet it happened. And that's kind of what this chapter is really about. The David versus Goliath story. All right. I'm going to put a link on because there is a new documentary which is basically Linsanity 10 years later, and it's a documentary revisiting the entirety of the story. I have not watched it yet, but I highly recommend you guys do watch it because I'm sure it's going to be phenomenal, and I'll link the trailer for it. So really, as any writer tries, or any good writer, any sports media tries, that we try to build these narratives behind sports, right? And it makes them that much more compelling to consume, right? And really, the ultimate narrative that sports media tries to produce is a rags to riches story of that underdog beating Goliath, and that's what Jeremy Lin was. He was the underdog. He ended up, coming back and beating Kobe Bryant, one of the greatest basketball players of all time, right? Uh, we should also try to recognize is that these stories, these narratives, aren't just kind of spun out of thin air all the time. Oftentimes, these narratives draw from a historical or cultural conditions of a given time. The term we can use for this is ethos or zeitgeist, right? The culture, the zeitgeist. What's that term we know? It's the spirit of the times. And usually these stories are kind of spun out of that, right? Again, for me, like the spirit of the times of being a New York Knicks fan was just this downtrodden. We didn't expect much, especially as Carmelo Anthony was injured. Everyone was filled with basically like half injury depression if you're knowing Carmelo Anthony was injured, and then sure enough, this thing kind of just happened, right? Um, so the book talks about three components, really: myths, rituals, and heroes. But I do argue that for a really good narrative, that there has to be a villain, or there should be a villain, right? And you try to think, well, who's the villain to every story? So I mean, I see, for any good story, and obviously I'm a comic book fan, but you've got Thanos, you've got the Joker, right? And for every good story, there has to be a great villain, in my opinion. So if you think about some of the stories, or great sporting stories, who was the villain for, Michael Jordan? Well, for Michael Jordan, the villain was the bad boy Pistons in the late 80s and early 90s, and Michael Jordan had to overcome them. A super physical team. If you want to think a little bit more recent, I think oftentimes uh, LeBron James and here's the beautiful thing about this: for some people, the villain can also be the hero, depending on whose view or perspective you're looking for him, right? LeBron James was a villain at one point in time in the NBA after he left the Cleveland Cavaliers. Right, he went from being this hero in his early years as the Cleveland Cavaliers to when he made the decision and moved over to the Miami. He was the villain, right? No one in the country really wanted LeBron James to win. Um, so again, every story has this villain that I think enhances the compellingness of the story. So, just some definitions, or at least how we define myths from the context of this chapter. Really, a myth is really a story of exceptional people doing exceptional things. Right, again, think back to Jeremy Lin. These are transcendent people. You will see the term in this chapter, transcendent, appear several times. And it really provides a compelling lens to view athletic achievements and events. And again, that's what communications in sports are about: creating compelling lenses to view achievements and events. If you think about the Super Bowl, every time the Super Bowl comes around, the media does a brilliant job of creating these narratives leading up to any events. Whether it's like Tom Brady and it's like his last Super Bowl, or whether it's even in the playoffs, like Tom Brady playing against Patrick Mahomes. Right, they create the old dog versus the new dog, and the future of the NFL. They create these narratives that really make it compelling to consume the material or the sport. Right. So like the one myth that the text kind of talked about in this section was Abner Doubleday and kind of the creation of the invention of baseball, which again has been discredited. But the whole point of this myth from like the early 1900s or the early 20th century was really to put forth American superiority over American sports versus European sports, right? So again, this is kind of connecting back to the ethos, like what were we trying to strive for by creating this story or this myth? So we got to always think back, like what was the feeling, the undertones of the culture and society at the time? There are flip side to myths, right? Oftentimes we think of myths in this positive light, but there are flip sides, and sometimes these can go unnoticed. Your book wrote about the movie or documentary Hoop Dreams. If you haven't seen it, it came out in 1994. It's a very good documentary, and it kind of follows two young athletes trying to quote unquote make it and get out of poverty. What I think some people kind of forget with that documentary is that the undertones of what it's like to be a young African American male, and essentially what their social inequality situation is. And kind of going forward, looking at The Blind Side, right? The movie The Blind Side, which is based on a real story. You know, Again, it's this kind of rags to riches type story. I wouldn't say riches, but this feel good story is what I would really say, of how a young African American boy, with not really much social qualities or things like that, and how this person takes him in and puts him in sport, and how sport becomes his positive outlet to inevitably go to college, so on and so forth. But if we always look at the flip side, and the other side of this is like there's been a research paper written about how what we kind of forget is this perpetuates some social inequalities in life, where it's like, oh yes, they are putting forth as the main character this young African American male, but who's the person that helps him in his life? Well, it is a white female, and it puts forth the narrative that potentially, like, a young African American male is helpless and needs the help of a white female, upper class female, and again, this isn't a research paper. This isn't my opinion. I think it's just important that we really look at stories from many different perspectives or viewpoints, because they're not always just these positive stories. There are many different sides to it. So the thing about myths, or the big takeaway here, is that what myths really do are they simplify what can be very complex topics, because it makes things much more easier to consume and enjoy. Okay. So we talk about rituals, right? And really, rituals are essential elements of sports mythology which enhance compellingness of myth or sport, right? So it enhances the compellingness of a story. If you talk about just basic rituals, you could talk about the LeBron chalk clap, right, which is pictured here. That is always going to be a ritual. If we go fast forward 50 years, 100 years down the road, and LeBron James continues to be remembered as one of the greatest, if not the greatest basketball player of all time, this is one thing that people will always remember from LeBron James. It is his ritual. Another ritual, Mariano Rivera and Enter the Sandman, right? His walkout song. If you go back, and if you are any sort of sports fan, and I'm not a big baseball fan, I'll just tell you that, but if you just kind of go YouTube Mariano Rivera Enter Sandman, and like his last game where they play the song, it gives you goosebumps, right? Like that's his ritual that people remember. And these first two are really just athlete rituals, but there's also the ritual of a fan and the participant consuming the sport. So, you go to a game, a basketball game, and what do people just start chanting? Defense, defense at certain points of the game, especially at the end of the game. If any of you guys have ever been to a close game at the ends, it's something that just enhances the compellingness. Again, I've said that several times, but the ritual aspect of sport is very, very important. Now, there are just, we kind of, again, look at things from both perspectives. The conformity of rituals. So what your book talks about is 9/11, and in the days, months, and years following 9/11, there was a great sense of patriotism, and rightfully so, within this country. But what I would say, again, looking at the other side of this, is what happens if you were somewhat hesitant to partake in some of these American or patriotic rituals in the years following it. And if you were inevitably vilified. So we have to be careful about kind of the downside of rituals. Another thing I'll say is sometimes we have this forgotten purpose of what we're trying to, I don't know, what the ritual might represent, right? What the ritual might represent. So my example, and this doesn't come from the textbook, is in CrossFit. Every Memorial Day, a very common event in CrossFit is the Murph, right? So this is where you're supposed to run a mile, do 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, and 300 squats, and then run another mile. And again, probably at this point, tens of thousands, if not more, of people partake in the Murph every single Memorial Day. But what I would say is, well, do we remember why we are partaking in the Murph? And the truth is, I've asked people, and they have no idea, right? They have no idea, and the Murph is put on as an event in remembrance of a fallen soldier killed in action, and I believe it was Afghanistan, and his name was Michael Murphy. So we're trying to we have to always remember the point of these rituals. So heroes. Right? We can't have a myth or a great story without a hero, right? And the definition we have is a hero is someone who is a transcendent individual who faces tests and trials of strength and character and is inevitably transformed. And they really transcend ordinary human qualities. So I've put forth a list of some examples: Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, Tom Brady, Mark McGwire, Lance Armstrong. And I think with this list, and when we think about heroes, one important thing is that we need to remember that heroes are just humans, and they do have these inherent flaws. Everyone on this list has had some controversy surrounding them, and sometimes the bigger the myth, the bigger the hero, we forget about these things until we kind of think back. If we look at like Michael Jordan. He's had some controversy surrounding him with his gambling tendencies, and even more so lately, right? Again, Michael Jordan is probably the most revered athlete in sports history, like any sport. In my opinion, he is the GOAT of GOATs, for so many different reasons. But lately, he has been criticized in recent years because he is someone who has the ultimate platform, but he is relatively quiet. You do not hear Michael Jordan speaking to the media that often. And, one specific aspect is he doesn't speak on politics. He doesn't speak on social inequalities, and he's been heavily criticized as a black man for not speaking up. So again, that's his right. He does not have to, but some people feel like that if you have a platform as big as he does, it is his responsibility or civic duty to kind of use that platform. If we kind of just jump down the list and talk about Mark McGwire, let's jump to Lance Armstrong. Some of you guys might say Lance Armstrong, he's not a hero. But if you lived in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Lance Armstrong was the hero of heroes. He was one of the most popular athletes at the time. He's someone who was a cancer survivor. He was on Oprah, and he was on every single talk show. He was I think it was a 7-time Tour de France winner who overcame cancer, the greatest cyclist of all time. But sure enough, he had a major fall from grace because inevitably it came out that he did use performance enhancing drugs. And then beyond that, he was attacking people. He would attack people who said he was on performance enhancing drugs and call them liars, right? So all of a sudden, his human flaws became much more evident, and he had this major fall from grace. Now, the last thing we have here is an anti-hero. An anti-hero is a figure who disrupts or challenges accepted beliefs. So I think the epitome of an anti-hero is Colin Kaepernick. Again, love him or hate him, agree with him or disagree with him, he fits this mold. He is someone who kneeled during the national anthem, around 2016, 2017, and he felt that we needed, we as a country needed to really look at the social inequalities within this country, specifically in black versus white people. Um, and again, some people absolutely villainized. Where are we? Last slide. And then just sport as a religion, right? In many ways, sports can be viewed closely with religion if you look at it from the sense of bringing intense excitement or spirit of community, right? It's an event that brings individuals together in a ritualistic fashion and promotes core values, right? If you think about the Olympics, right? And there's the picture of the Olympics. We bring people of different races, ethnicities, countries together, promoting the Olympic core values. Now, some people might argue that viewing sports as religion kind of takes it too far and kind of undermines what religion really is. But again, I think if you look at it from this definition of what sports do, I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to view sports. So for your assignment, one, you're going to read A Matter of Ethics, which really discusses NFL and CTE. Address questions 1 through 4 in a PDF or Word document. I think for most of these questions, they are more than one sentence responses. Especially number 4, right? Like what do you think the NFL can do? So these are probably for each question, we're probably looking for something like a paragraph. If you wanted to go to 2 paragraphs, that's fine, but definitely more than one sentence to address these questions. And then, most importantly, tell me about a sporting myth of your choosing, right? And while you're looking at that sporting myth, specifically, like lay the background. What is the foundation for which that myth is built upon? Okay, with Linsanity, I laid the background for you guys and how I felt as a Knicks fan and how most Knicks fans felt where they were out of it and Carmelo Anthony was injured, so on and so forth, right? What about how does that myth reflect the ethos or zeitgeist of that era? And that kind of goes hand in hand with the background. But this again should be probably like 1 to 2 paragraphs, give or take, and should be submitted via Blackboard. If you have any questions, let me know.